Thanks so much everyone for coming. End of the year, the last event. Colleen McCulloch is hosting us tonight from Shepherd Mullen, and I'll let her say a few words.
Hi, welcome everyone. So nice to see a good turnout for this time of year. There's a lot going on, a lot of events. But I think probably like me, you were really compelled by the subject, the topic for this panel tonight. I'm really interested to hear what's going to happen in 2019. But we can't wait. I'm here in the San Francisco office. We have almost 100 lawyers here in San Francisco, and then many more throughout California. We do a lot of FinTech work, finance, and I practice securitization, so monetization of blockchain and digital currency is a pretty exciting area. We're pleased and honored to have everyone here in this panel here. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. Okay, so John Boydnott is a journalist and he's the moderator for tonight. He's moderated a few panels for us and he's great. So I'm going to pass it over to him so he can let everyone introduce themselves.
All right, Pemo, thank you so much. This is like my 6th or 7th for Pemo. She's fantastic. And at the end, we're going to give her a big round of applause for her. So yeah. All right, my name is John Boydnott. I'm a journalist at Inc. and entrepreneur. I've been doing these for a little while. Let me know if you need any ghostwriting or copywriting help in your lives. Okay, so let's go to the 4 of you guys and have you just each spend a minute talking about who you are and your background. So let's start with Tim over there.
Hi, I'm Tim. I'm a white guy in my 30s in the Bay Area, so they called me up and asked me to be on the diversity panel. This is my book, and I've been out here for about 5 years. We're actually just moving the Bay Area, so it's nice to see you. Thank you for allowing us to be here. I run a consultancy called Post-Oak Labs. It's a FinTech consultancy. Prior to that, I worked for a company called R3, and I do some advisory work for a company called Nadaq in the UK.
I'm Bedoya. I'm not white. So I'm the VP of, well, it's okay. I'm still I'm the VP of Product and Design at Civic Technologies. We are an identity platform built using blockchain technology. I've been doing product and design for a little over 15 years now, mostly here in the Bay Area, Los Angeles, and I'm originally from Peru.
Hi, I'm Pierre Wolf. I work as a VP of Business Development for a company called Tyrion. We timestamp and anchor digital content in the Bitcoin blockchain. I've been in the space probably since about 2013. I was fortunate enough to actually meet Tim very early in that process and have watched the evolution of the space in really interesting ways and enjoying being on the panel.
Awesome. So great to be here. My name is Jeremy Almond. I'm the CEO of a company called PayStand. We are a B2B payment network. You can think about what Venmo does between consumers, making digital transactions happen. We do between commercial entities. Super unsexy business. These guys will probably have way cooler companies to talk about, but I think we're one of the fastest growing fintech companies in the US right now. We've been built in the blockchain. I've personally been in the blockchain space for about 7 years and have been in digital commerce and fintech for about 15, so excited.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's just get right to it and talk about sort of what is the elephant in the room. And you talk to anyone you know about any cryptocurrency or the blockchain space or whatever, and they immediately just say what they know, which is that the price of Bitcoin has gone down, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of you guys feel like that's a great thing, right? Because it's sort of weeding out speculative elements. Has it slowed investment interest? What have you guys seen as far as the investment side of things?
Yeah, I just saw a chart about this a couple days ago. A Bloomberg reporter put it out. I think Camel and Rosa, I believe. Looks like VC funding is still continuing. It actually surpassed ICO funding for the first time in a year or so. I'm not investing myself. Clearmatic's one of the companies I work with. They just received some investment, so I don't think it's dried up if you're still starting to sell something that's useful, or at least pretend it's useful, rather than just some coin that's capturing the mania. So no, I don't think it's disappeared if you try to build a real product.
Is it keep on going. Any other thoughts around whether or not investment is dried up or if there's no real issue there?
And, sorry, when you say investment, you're talking about investment in the Bitcoin and token economy or investment in companies? Yeah, no, I think there's no lack of investment. Again, I think the focus is just matured. I hate to say mature because it is what it was before this kind of temporary 2007 mania. So before you had, companies went through a more structured growth path. They would raise a seed stage round, and that would enable them to get the product at least to a proof of concept, maybe even deployed, some notion of product market fit, some sense that there was a real market for what they were doing. This would lead to a Series A, which would further help them grow and professionalize or scale their product. Series B to really scale the business in terms of sales and distribution. And so we saw a real path where you weren't given $20 million day one, you were really worked into the place where you knew how to spend $20 million. So I don't see a slowdown in that side of things. I do see a tremendous slowdown in kind of the mania side of things.
Jeremy, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that there has been a tremendous change both pre 2 or 3 years ago, the last 2 or 3 years, and then what's happened now. We're a traditional venture funded company. We've raised no money on tokens, even though a lot of our infrastructure is built on the blockchain. It was fascinating. A couple of years ago, I felt like we were one of the only blockchain companies that wasn't raising an ICO. So I look at it now, and companies that were getting funded a year or 2 ago on some kind of ICO process, like they had no business to be funding. They wouldn't have got funded 3 years ago, and they can't get funded now. So absolutely, it's changed. So yes, venture hasn't changed. Venture will remain. I think actually venture in some ways is now grokking some of the changes in democratizing finance in general. And so we'll see some new changes out of that in a good way. But I think if you're a FinTech company, things were crazy a year or 2 ago. Crazy in not a good way. It was crazy in a 99, 2000s kind of way. We're past that now, and companies are building real companies now, which is good, but it is definitely different.
Any thoughts, JP?
Well, I think it's definitely changed, but I think for the better in so many ways because it's really making the industry mature much more. So you're seeing now companies that really want to raise money, they are much more professional and focused, and it's not about how to make a quick buck. It's really what is that company, what is that product, what is that service I want to build that is going to be meaningful and people will understand.
Yeah, what are some of the tough technological issues that some of these companies are trying to solve at this point in the space?
Well, I think that the question is, what are they not trying to solve in the space, right? I generally think that when you look at blockchain as a technology, it's basically reinventing everything that we have today, right? I don't think it's coming in and replacing. It's changing what we have, the way that we're doing certain things, the way that we're doing identity, right? Like Civic, we're not here to kill identity. We're here to improve identity and whatnot. So other companies are probably going to be similar, right? You guys, right? You're here to fix a lot of the B2B payment processes that are, fundamentally broken, and I think it's great. I really want to know more about what you guys are doing. So I think that's one, right? And then thinking about scalability of the stack. I think that's another big thing that we need to focus on.
Okay, so what you're talking about is sort of the blockchain disappearing into the infrastructure of things, no matter whether it's payments or whether it's identity. Pierre, why is that important? I remember you told me that that's something that you'd like to see in the next several years is for this technology to just not even be something that we think about.
Yeah, I mean, so I see about 2 to 3 business plans a week, just because I have a lot of friends in the investor space who are angel investors and are looking at sometimes deals in the blockchain space, deals where blockchains are part of the proposition. And what's usually interesting to me is that the conversation starts with, well, we're a blockchain company that does blah, 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 blah. And the blah, 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 blah is the problem that they're really solving, that they identify themselves as blockchain. And part is to get attention. But by contrast, and I mentioned this earlier to Tim and to Fimo, but there was a company in Brazil that's in the trade finance business. This company was introduced to me as a company that's doing something in the blockchain space. The founder spent 45 minutes with me on the phone, and by the end of it, I said, you've got this really wonderful trade finance business, well thought through for the market. But I have a question for you. You never mentioned blockchain. Can you explain to me how you use it? And at the end of it, he actually was using Corda, which is not a blockchain. It's a digital ledger technology inspired by blockchain, I believe was a line they used to throw out there. But the way it was used was underlying their software, and the companies that were using it never knew that this was there. So the company was focused in terms of their business proposition on a real problem and delivering a real solution. But just like I don't sit here and tell you, oh yeah, we're building this application. Oh, and it runs on database. We don't have to say that. It's implied that you're using technology to solve it. And again, I think blockchain is one of those things that when we understand it to just be a technology that has a role in an infrastructure, then that's where we should leave it and not be blockchain companies.
Other thoughts from any of you guys about other ways that will happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's in this nuclear winter, so to speak, in the blockchain world is it's actually getting people to focus on what are the advantages. I don't actually know if blockchain for everything is if I'm fully agree with that. I think there are a number of areas where blockchain is transformative. But when you talk about a lot of business plans, the number of business plans I saw for the last few years on things that the blockchain actually fundamentally didn't improve was really, really high. And so there are certain things that the blockchain does do fundamentally better. And so getting to those core use cases that create value where you don't need to talk about the blockchain, that's starting to happen. And it's also starting to weed out companies that were doing things that arguably weren't all that much better. We sell to CFOs and CIOs of big, unsexy, mid-market enterprise companies most of our time. And the number of times that we had people come to us and say, we want blockchain. We said, for what? And said, I don't know, it just sounds cool. That's not a good sign, right? So I think you're actually seeing in this stage, all these companies are focused on real businesses with real value, creating technology that actually advances the ball forward, whether that's identity, whether that's data security and data management, right? Whether it's settlement. I think those are the key use cases, and those are the things that will, in many ways, it's like the mid-2000s, right, where the companies that are iconic technology companies of today were built in that stage where they're saying, what are the advantages of what they called back then Web 2.0? What are those things going to create, right? And so I think that's the stage we're in a lot of ways right now. So.
Can I make a comment on that real quick?
No.
Just so that, I'm going to make a comment anyways.
On the diversity panel?
Yeah,
I actually secretly rely on his iconoclastic comments. They're fantastic.
So,
Go ahead.
I was just double checking myself. There was an organization last week called Merl Tech, MERL Tech. They announced that they looked at 43 different use cases that people had talked about this last year. They found that zero out of 43 had been fulfilled. So basically, it was a lot of press, but nothing was actually built or actually worked to do what they said they could do. So, I'm not saying that people won't eventually get something to do, but I know that I've got massive fatigue over the last few years of just hearing every single pitch. So, you feel free to pitch me again if you want. And I'm billing you for that pitch, but I probably won't be a cheerleader for the ideas unless it's really unique.
Okay. Identity management is one of the things that you mentioned, JP, and I know you're working with Civic, which handles that. Let's talk about sort of the way that looks right now, what you guys are working on right now, and then 2-3 years, talk about or longer, further out than that, like refugee camps, that kind of thing, which you brought up to me when we talked a while back about being the way that, how can you help refugee camps with identity management? How does that, but we'll get to that.
Yeah. No, it's really great because when you think about identity, it's fundamental to everything that we do as people, right? You need to go someplace, you need to identify yourself. You want to go through the airport, you need to identify yourself. You want to go to school, you want to get a degree, you want to buy something, everything, right? So fundamentally speaking, unfortunately, identity is broken, right? You see what has happened with our identities, all our data is all over the place, and we basically don't own it anymore, right? So with that in mind, identity management is something that needs to be fixed, right? And in applications to that, when you think about not everybody has an identity or access to that identity, that's where the refugee camps example comes into play, right? Because you have these people that are, fleeing a country and trying to make a living somewhere else. A lot of these people, you don't even know who they are. They don't have a way to identify themselves. They don't have a way to show their credentials. There's doctors, there's scientists, there's all these people that could be bringing significant value to that host country, right? So that's really just one example, right? And that's why we believe identity is so fundamental that needs to be really addressed. And blockchain is something that we're using as that underlying technology. We don't go and say, oh, we're this blockchain company. No, we're an identity company that is solving this problem.
And a really practical example of that right now, we were talking before this started, like let's say I want to go visit a company, and that's some of the type of stuff that you're partnering right now. Like people want to go visit somebody at a company and they just pull out their app and then they don't have to sign in or anything, it's already there already.
Right, that's another great use case, right? Whenever you visit a place, or there's certain companies that now you come in, there's a place that you need to sign in, you need to show your ID and whatnot. So there's some privacy concerns there, like who's this person that now is seeing all my information, now has my age, my address, and all this type of stuff. So if we can change that and provide that same level of authority and comfort, right, for that host company, and then to that person that is visiting, giving that additional privacy, we think that we can then fundamentally change how a lot of these things are working. And we just announced a partnership with Johnson Controls today that has one of those type of solutions that is going to include Civic as part of that identity process.
The one thing I do want to say about identity is, we're on a panel here, we have very limited time, so it's a hard topic to go deep in. But it's a very complicated topic, and I think some of the examples that JP provided show just how different the problems are. The notion of refugees, and I met with the folks at World Health Organization before they deployed that system, and that's a radically different problem than visitors at a desk.
Right.
And in the solutions right now, the challenges to determine whether or not these are going to be solutions that can be normalized into one set of infrastructure, or if there's a way to really focus on solutions for each of those problems that may or may not overlap. So I think that the technologies are still being figured out, whether it's a blockchain or not. Identity's been at play since the Web 1.0, so it is not an easy problem, and it's being tackled by a lot of people. So again, exciting that this is a space in which it's being attempted and tried, but it's still early and there's a lot of parts to it.
Any thoughts on identity management?
Well, so one thing I'd say, maybe more broadly related to this, that it's a big universe and there's a lot of moving parts and there's a lot of different people trying to attack it. I actually think that's one of the more interesting areas that we will see the blockchain evolve into, and one of the advantages it has. The web that we know today is was not a foregone conclusion, right? So there was this thing called AOL, and they'd send CDs, right? And it was sort of this walled garden. And it turns out that the web is, right, this complicated series of disparate sets of resources. And so the blockchain, in a lot of ways, I think will become this area where different solutions can actually interact. And that's one of the areas that we see is whether it's different identity solutions, or in our case, different solutions across the supply chain or otherwise, the thing that actually the blockchain does well and unique and has not been fully built or matured to yet is how do disparate solutions actually interact? How do different loyalty points interact? How do different ERP or financial systems interact? How do different identity systems interact? It creates a sense of common connection, whereas the web was a common communication point. And so I think this is an area that's very, very early right now, but I'm personally really interested in seeing how that gets built out in the next 5 or 10 years, as we're laying a lot of the groundwork for companies that are being built today.
But, sorry, just to press on that, what are you seeing in terms of interconnectivity that you feel excited about that could address all this? Because there's not a lot happening there's a lot of attempts, but not a lot of solutions being rolled out in the interconnectivity.
Yeah, so I would say an area that is, I believe, a next wave area is what exchanges do is actually underappreciated, right? So an exchange connects two sets of assets that are disparate groups as a way to actually change one asset to another, right? And so right now, the sort of tokenization of everything, it's kind of gone through this wave, but one of the things that it creates the opportunity around is how do different assets that normally could not interchange begin to interchange, right? And that's something that an exchange can do. We don't have the groundwork entirely for something like that yet, but we're getting there, right? And I think that's actually a very exciting thing to me. It's this notion of the openness that blockchain, at least philosophically, has built in. I think at least is paving the way for an open internet, now an open form of asset exchange. So.
I mean, I do think that there's something that fundamentally we need to solve is chains don't interoperate, right, per se, and then you have permissioned and public chains and whatnot. And it's really interesting that you're saying this because I think we may be creating a problem, right, with all these chains, all these tokens that are being created, everybody's coming out with some coin and whatnot. So I really like what you said because if we're not really careful with that, we might be creating silos.
Yeah. Okay, great. One thing I wanted to ask you guys about was talent. You describe the situation right now as kind of a nuclear winter a little bit. Are there not enough jobs for developer talent, or are there plenty? Or is there a talent exodus? What are you guys seeing right now in the blockchain crypto space?
I think the talent is always a problem in our space, blockchain or not, right? Finding talent is really, really difficult, right? There's all these great ideas, there's very limited people, right? I looked at the number, it's the million and something jobs in tech, and there's only going to be like 400,000 or 500,000 people to address it. So I think a lot of things that companies like Civic and others are doing is really going, we are building on top of decentralized technology. We can also be a decentralized company, right? So we have our team all over the world. So I think that's one of the ways for us to fight this talent issue that I think we probably all face.
So for those who have been following news, there's a large organization called Consensus with a Y. They just announced that they're laying off 13% of their employees as of last week. And you have maybe 5-6 other organizations, Steemit, laid off everyone 30%, all but 30% or something like that. So I guess that raises a couple questions. Number one, a lot of these projects seem to be I'm not a lawyer, but we're in a law firm, so we'll pretend for one quick second before you guys start building me, scaling me out. You have a central group typically that's coordinating efforts that benefit themselves and those who own these coins. And if they're all depending on the coin value going up to sustain the business, if you have this quote unquote bear market, you have this interesting issue to where the primary coordinator of these activities goes bust. And as a result, you end up with, to your point, these 2,000 or so silos. And there's a website, by the way, called deadcoins.com. You can actually go see all these coins that are completely inactive. And as a result, you may end up with, if a refugee group, like the most marginalized, at-risk group ever, had their identities hashed on a chain that no longer is being supported, that creates some fundamental issues. So from an existential standpoint, yeah, there are people to be hired, but more to the point, if that one chain was dependent on the efforts of one particular group and they go bust, you might have sustainability issues that the public goods economists have been looking at for decades, if not centuries.
Talent, as you said, is always a problem. It's compounded because talent, what people often don't appreciate about what's happened in blockchains is when you look at the level of technical skill that either the folks that are working in the blockchain level technology, whether it be for Ethereum or for Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash, and there's even EOS, the level of technical skill, there's not an unlimited pool of people, even if they were technical, who could do that work. So that's one area of constraint. The other area is that, for those who are competent in standard languages, blockchain is just one sector. Whether you're in the IoT space or drones or just the FANG, which is the Facebook, Amazon, Google, and who's before my Netflix. Right. This is a big group of people, and I have to talk to companies that are wanting to bring talent here. Let's say they're from somewhere else, and they're like, oh yeah, we got to be in Silicon Valley. It's where it's all happening. It's where the funding is. And I'm like, look, open an office here with like the two of you and leave your team back wherever, because as soon as they land here, they become chum for those companies, because those guys can pay the kinds of salaries and benefits that no startup can afford to match. And so it then starts to figure, well, am I picking off the right kind of people who would want to be in a startup? Sure, but again, these offers that we see coming out of the Googles and Facebooks of the world are amazing. So it's not just like, oh gee, I have a dream to be at a startup. It's like, well, I can get all this experience being with these guys and then go do something later. So it is really hard to nail that talent down here. You've probably seen a different with that.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know I was going to be so contrarian today. I think actually.
No problem getting people.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's a good time for hiring right now. It's so what we're experiencing is, because we're global by nature, right? As the internet and blockchain in general, there is now a group of rabid people who are interested in the blockchain, and what's happened over the last few years is people have gotten interested because of economics. And then many of them, oftentimes I'd sit on these panels and people say, well, what can I do? Should I buy currency? I say, no, go work at a company building something, right? That's where you can create a lot of value. And so I think there's been a first generation of people who've gone to work at a company that did an ICO, and then that ICO, was sitting on, I don't know, Ethereum, and then Ethereum's now at whatever it's at, right? And so that's not sustainable, and those people are looking for new jobs. And so paystand.com/jobs. So yeah, I mean, I'm being glib about it, but at the same time, again, like the iconic companies of today were built out of the 2000s, so I think the iconic companies are being built out of it. And the people who, got some experience in blockchain 2 years ago now have enough experience to go either, in some ways work at the companies that are going to thrive, or go start something, right? Go start something now, right? Now that you have an experience, and go build that next company of the next decade. And so I think in a lot of ways, this is a really, really good time for talent. And yes, in Silicon Valley, it's hard, but actually I think that's something unique that blockchain companies have that your standard web app SaaS company doesn't have, who's trying to hire against Google or Facebook, is people who generally want to work in the blockchain space want to work there because they're passionate about it. They want to create impact, and they believe in it. They're fundamental missionaries in a lot of ways. And so I think this is actually a really good time, because you can build iconic companies that don't have to go the Netflix, Google route where it's Teslas for everybody and massages, because people are building something because they want to make a difference. So.
Got it, okay. So there's been a lot of talk about how, whatever situation the space is in right now could be similar to post-2001, whatever, or maybe it's more like 1997 with the World Wide Web, depending on who you talk to. So you're saying that the companies that will be the next Amazons, Googles, et cetera, in the future could be existing right now. What are some of the problems that they're solving, or which are the ones that are receiving the most investor enthusiasm, have you seen, do you think?
I don't know, these guys are doing some cool stuff, so.
You're out there?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I would say I personally have this thesis that blockchain is effectively the new cloud, right? So, if you look at what did cloud do in the enterprise space and in startups in general? So, if you were to start a company 15 years ago now, you'd have to go take a lot of venture capital and put it in front of servers and infrastructure and a lot of stuff that actually didn't matter for the product or service you were building. And then there's this thing called the cloud and Amazon and AWS, where you could spin stuff up really, really fast, and you could actually think about the stuff that you actually want to deliver to customers. And so it changed the funding landscape because people were actually funding businesses with seed capital, which seed capital, it's hard to think of, but wasn't really a thing 10 years ago. But seed capital became a thing because the cost of actually starting a startup became much lower. And the cost of starting a startup became much lower because you could put it on cloud. The next thing the cloud did is now there's all kinds of iconic enterprise companies like Salesforce and NetSuite and whatever. Those companies made a decision a decade ago that cloud was going to be the thing, and they were going to use the leverage of the technology to build faster, cheaper, and more efficient. And so they become those things. It's a long way of saying I believe that blockchain is cloud today. So the companies that are building moats in technology that are leveraging blockchain are able to build things faster, cheaper, and more efficiently. It's not about being a blockchain company. Like, it's simply that it helps us get to market faster, cheaper, and more efficiently. So whether that's in the identity space, the data space, or in the payments and financial service space, I can get to market and I can outbeat a bank because I don't have to build all of the banking stack, right? I can focus on the things that make commercial banking better without having to go rebuild half of the infrastructure that's been around for 50 years collecting cobwebs. So.
Tim, do you agree?
A little bit, but I think there's some other questions that we could go through too. The reason I'm laughing is because, I think they're laughing, is because I've talked a lot about intermediation in the financial industry. Does anyone work for an intermediary like CCP, clearinghouse, or an exchange, or a central bank? Okay, does anyone have a job? For those who are
Back to
watching
paystand.com/jobs.
For those of you watching the video, there was no hands raised. So, to be fair, the way the financial market infrastructures exist today, they were all built and organized prior to today's technology. So intermediation existed for good reasons, in retrospect, to reduce risk and to identify participants who can be held accountable. However, I think the argument goes, at least according to the FinTech world, is hey, we have ways of automating processes that took manual labor to do, and the theory, again, I don't want to be sitting here seen as a salesman or a cheerleader or something, so I have to really be careful about my words, but I guess the picture they would make is using a shared infrastructure, as it were. By the way, this is not the first time people have done shared infrastructure. You have back office shared efforts for years within banks. But I don't want to name specific vendors, but the idea here is if you get mutualize and share a ledger or a record of information, again, I'm not going to go into the whole blockchain pitch, but if you could share that, what parts of intermediation can you remove in a safe way that complies with PFMIs? Does anyone know what the PFMIs are? I thought we were in a law. What is this law? So PFMIs, Principles for Financial Market Infrastructure, was published in 2012 by basically the Financial Stability Board, the BIS, CPMI. All these organizations exist because you have extreme concentration of intermediation in the financial industry. What if you could replace some of that of those good rules and guidelines with technology? So to answer your question, I don't necessarily disagree with the point because I don't know enough about this company, but I think this has been all these companies going out and saying we've got a blockchain, whatever that is. I think is completely missing the point. If you're not looking at intermediation or disintermediation, the intermediation, then to me I think you're just wasting your time. Which means all of you guys are wasting your time.
There is one point of irony in all of this, is that blockchains have been touted as a technology around decentralization, distributed computing, and so on, and yet a lot of the movement of how they're being deployed is on AWS. And so, I'm always nervous when I hear this talk because I'm like, yeah, that's all great, but it's still AWS, and so the risks that were attempted to be mitigated are just being fostered with a different spin on. So I guess I'm less driven by that singular notion of what a blockchain can do. I do believe strongly in what you said around the cloud, and the cloud is important. I wouldn't equate the blockchain with the cloud because the blockchains are running on the cloud. So it would be a different level of the stack to think about. And then what are the problems we're solving? And for so many problems I'm seeing out there, at least so many that are touted with blockchains are probably the only thing that shouldn't apply to those things. And so I'm seeing a lot, my contrarian position is that 90% of what I see in industry that is touting the use of a blockchain to solve a problem forgets that some of the problems they're solving require much more fundamental issues. I'll give you a super simple example. Supply chain. We're gonna put we're gonna start tracking for organic foods, and we're gonna make sure that the organic food is what's coming to your table. Except that, you have to start this with the farm where it's picked. And so the question
the seed.
The seed, okay. So
And
how
I
are
want
you going
to talk to you about the opioid crisis too, and how drugs can be tracked too. But
Fair, and this might fall into that. So we say, okay, well, how are the farmers tracking that today? Well, it's really kind of happenstance, and we kind of have to trust them to say that they're doing the right thing. So what are we going to do because of the blockchain? Well, that's not the problem yet. We're still trying to figure out how to get the farmer to report accurately and how to believe that what they're saying into this immutable thing is going to be accurate. So now imagine that I don't have an inspector who can sit next to every farmer who's putting stuff on this new system. So the problem's still, great. Now I've tracked it from where it came to where it's going, but I still don't have the information that, quote unquote, I was promising to deliver. So this is where, again, I'm always stuck with, is the problem that's being solved the right problem, and is the blockchain have an impact on it?
love to hear, go ahead, Jeremy, if you have any thoughts, or I was going to ask about, how would that work for drugs?
Drugs is way more sexy than what I was gonna talk about.
How would that work for, whatever your drug of choice is in pill form that you're, wanting to
Well,
track?
we're not
You
talking
track
about recreational drugs at this point, right? But if you really think about how can you track things, right? You start with supply chain.
blood pressure medication, whatever.
Which I
It's stressful,
actually take, and they're really good. They've been really good to me. So, but at the end of the day, it's about being able to track the movement of something, right? For the drug problem that we have here, right? If we really were able to hold the different parts of the flow accountable, and then disintermediation here comes to play, right? If you're able to disintermediate, who's actually making those checks? But at the end of the day, you need that trust mechanism. And that, I think, is what will break anything that we do. If you don't have that entity, if you don't trust the entity that is writing on that tracker, then in this case it's the blockchain. Because really, you could solve it without a blockchain as long as you can trust whoever is writing, and that's written is not going to be changed, right? Because that ultimately is what blockchain does, right? What gets written cannot be changed, but who writes it, it's also needs to be trusted. So, just long story short, bringing it together with drugs, well, if you can track everything, then you can really hold people accountable and entities accountable, and that's what we need, right? So if blockchain can enable holding entities accountable, I think we win.
So Tyrion has a client that's a blockchain software company.
That's the company you work
Yeah,
with.
so Tyrion, and all we do is take digital content and timestamp it and put it on the Bitcoin blockchain. This is a software company that is not using blockchain. This is a software company that's using good old-fashioned databases. They work with large pharma companies, and they facilitate supply chains for these large companies. And for them, there is no blockchain problem that they saw. What they did have an issue with is that in the case of pharma, there are regulatory mandated steps in a blockchain that have to be checked and have to be reported. And for that, they wanted the assurance that when they checked it, that information that was within the process was put on a blockchain so it could be immutable. So they could prove that at this point they had a particular piece of content. But again, in that scenario, What they didn't feel was a need to re-architect the platform into being blockchain dependent. Simply, they just wanted the timestamp. And whether they were using a blockchain to timestamp or whether they were using one of the existing standards for timestamping, they could have used either. So just to give you an example that, yes, they could still leverage this technology, but not because they were running everything through it.
Okay, oh, go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, so I think one thing maybe on the supply chain side, because we see a lot of our customers in the supply chain, the one thing to not be underestimating what the blockchain can do is, yes, it's immutable, but it also is the power of having something open when there's a bunch of disparate systems is actually surprisingly powerful. So when you talk about, I don't know, in insurance companies we deal with all the time, there's a bunch of people in that value chain. There's the agents, there's the brokerages, the carriers, the reinsurance, right? It turns out that like all of those people have crusty old software, and that software doesn't talk to each other. So it seems like a simple thing, but a way to be able to get things to talk to each other. There's not an existing standard, whether it's on the financial side or the data side. So we see actually quite commonly, actually in farm, we work with one of the largest seed distributors in the US. And what they use it for is they need to make financial decisions and financial actions. And along the supply chain, they need people to be able to talk to each other. Does it have to use a blockchain? Maybe, maybe not. That's sort of a technical discussion. But it is a way to get different stakeholders to have a common discussion without getting IT to try to get them to integrate ERP systems, which is extremely hard. So again, the blockchain is, one of its things is it's immutable, but another thing is it can be an open standard of sorts for people to be able to talk to each other and exchange information in a semi-permissioned way, right? And so there's different blockchains doing different ways, but that's another use case for blockchain in the value chain.
I'm sorry, but Jeremy, even in that scenario, and I think you made the point that a blockchain isn't necessarily necessary, and you still need to integrate into those systems. So the blockchain is not this thing that, oh, if I have it, I'm now in the system. No, you still have to integrate your systems. There's still, IT's still gonna be involved. All of those hurdles still have to be met. So I agree, this is a technical issue. But yeah, the problem is supply chain tracking, technology, well, databases or blockchains, who cares? So long as it solves that particular need that those, the other thing, let's not forget that in blockchains, it's about ecosystems. So, and the driver of that ecosystem has unusual power in the blockchain. And so that's another tricky thing, that the public blockchains were meant to enable kind of participants to balance each other out. In a private blockchain, you don't have that. So immutability is kind of not really true, because the controller can do a lot of things and can prevent people writing into the blockchain. So this is, again, very tricky. We tend to get high level, and in a small panel, it's hard to get into those issues, but this is the things that I think make this very hard.
So a quick thing I'd like to add.
By the way, in just a few minutes, we'll be taking questions, like in around 5-10 minutes. So think about it, have some questions ready if you like.
Something that I think is important what Jeremy said, I think it's the opportunity to be more nimble, and somebody like you guys comes in and says, I can make that work, and I'm gonna use the blockchain. I think that's the point. There's still gonna be work, there's still IT, whatnot, but it's like, it's not gonna be this complicated mess, and I think that was the point that you were trying to make there. Right now, we're gonna use this other thing, it's gonna be a public blockchain, doesn't matter what it is, and I'm gonna make it really simple for your company, for your IT department, to come in and have that conversation. I remember EDI back in the day, right?
Exactly.
Holy crap, that was a mess.
Okay, great. Talking about Venezuela, I managed to talk about that with all you guys at some point, I believe.
Beautiful country.
Yeah, sure, and not so much the society currently, unfortunately. But do you think a stable coin can take the place of fiat money, kind of like how it is done in Venezuela? Do you see that happening in more countries as we march on into the future here? I mean, famously, Africa skipped landlines and went straight to cell phones. That kind of logic, is that something that we see with money?
Well, I don't know how long-lived this Venezuela thing is going to be.
Yeah.
Right, because really at the end of the day, you have a government that wants to control people, and currency is one of the best ways to control people. You know, I grew up in a third world country, right? So I understand it really well, right? And I've seen Venezuela, I visited Venezuela, when you really think about, like, what have they done, right? Like, yeah, the petroleum company issued a token, and now they issued a brand new currency, but it's never gonna be a stable coin, right? That, I personally don't believe that a government like that, I hope that they're not gonna come and send someone to my house to look for me, but,
That's right, you're on Facebook.
that just doesn't work for what those type of governments want to do.
There you go. Ooh.
Stable coins. All right, raise your hand. Who knows those stable coins? All right. So just for
Can you
those.
identify the 3 types of stablecoin?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not going to go into the whole history, but I will say that as of right now, there's about 70 or so proposals or live quote-unquote stable coins, the majority of which are basically ERC20 tokens on Ethereum. So this is 2 problems with the term stablecoin. It's neither stable and it's not really a coin. They're these tokens that rely on that piggyback on top of other platforms. So the reason, ignoring Venezuela for the moment, you have a magnification of problems. Number one, typically a quote-unquote stablecoin has money sitting somewhere on someone's behalf. And so you have credit risk, usually with a bank, a commercial bank. And what we found out during the financial crisis 10 years ago, and why we have something called the PFMIs, is because banks and the financial intermediaries around them collapsed or had the inability to recover from a default properly. So if you actually have stablecoins that become anything to the equivalent of a modern day currency in the sense that they have trillions of dollars of an M0 or something like that, which is the narrowest of narrow money supplies, you would have, if that bank collapsed that held that coin, the money in current as reserves, you would see that ripple effect just completely wipe out any of the instruments, the financial instruments that depended on them. And they're not actual central bank digital currency. So like we could have a whole conversation about CBDCs, which I actually think is a very interesting piece of utility, but stablecoins are not CBDCs, so please don't conflate them. The second problem is, since they're all on top of Ethereum effectively, if Ethereum has a hard fork crisis or a governance crisis or something like that, you truly concentrate risk on a platform in which nobody is accountable. You can't call up miners in China and hold them accountable for doing a fork. Again, I'm not trying to single out China. My wife's Chinese and I love China as a visitor. Please don't put me on a sanctions list. But irrespective, if you quote unquote anarchic chains, these public chains that are going left as a market, have that fundamental issue of you don't have settlement finality, which you need to have for financial intermediation or financial institutions to take fewer risks on. And number 2, you can't hold anyone accountable because there's no terms of service, there's no end user license agreement, there's none of these things that we need as a society to be able to hold participants accountable. So I know that's a little bit of a rant, but I truly think that stablecoins are neat, but it's massively crazy and socially backwards idea.
So I think the one thing that's funny about that is that was a great 2-minute version of what definitely is like a 20-minute discussion on stablecoins, and I think was really packed with a lot of good information, which I mostly agree with. The thing that was crossing through my mind just now is it's amazing that we've done pretty much this whole panel, it's just wrapping up, and not one of us has mentioned Bitcoin, right? Like, so maybe it's not cool, but the conversation back to the Venezuela piece, right, is beyond just, did you? Okay. Clearly, I blew
I think I may have mentioned it in my first question.
30
briefly.
second, yeah,
So
so
we're busting John.
we moved past it, I don't know.
Sorry. But I may not have actually.
God, I'm old, we're talking.
He's got a train.
All right, what is a chain? No, so I think the thing is, right, the granddaddy of the Bitcoin piece, right, is we're talking about all this other stuff, and the reality is, there is still significant volume in this grand experiment that started 10 years ago. And I think one of the things that Venezuela and other parts do is start showing us that there is behavior that is getting trained in a generation, right? My sister is 12 years younger than me, and seeing her behavior, whether it's with not owning a car, but instead Ubering everywhere, or being conscious of using digital currency for things, right? Like that behavior is getting ingrained in people. So yes, there's blockchain use cases that our companies work on, but then there's also just the straight up digital money aspect that was a grand experiment a decade ago. And it still has not played out fully, but more and more people have seen it, and that has to go somewhere. So in Venezuela, if you look at the charts and the volume of actual local trading that happens in Bitcoin is continuing to go up, right? And so what happens to those people who've learned a behavior about something where their system is broken and they're putting faith in something that is completely different than 10 years ago, right? So I think, I don't know what that grand experiment will, but I'm still rooting for it, right? And so I think we can't forget that volume is there. There's still new people who are entering that ecosystem every day, and just because it's at 3,000 instead of 17,000 does not mean it's gone away. So.
And maybe from a Venezuela perspective, Bitcoin is more stable than their currency perspective, right? Stable coins, and I asked him about the three types. So he's right about the 70 proposals, but they really fall into three types of stable coins. One is dollar-backed stable coins, or currency-backed, so euros or dollars. There is the Ethereum-backed, and those probably frighten me almost the most of all. And just when I thought I heard that was the worst, and I think DAI is a Ethereum-backed, there's Basis, which is an algorithmically derived stablecoin. And that scares the bejesus out of me. Because it's one thing to say that the dollar loses value and we're tied to that. But it's a whole different thing to say, hey, bet on Ethereum, as the value of Ethereum is what's creating a stablecoin. And then an algorithm, boy, that's truly in a whole other place. So I'm really not a fan of what's going on with that. And I don't think that their intention has been to replace fiat as a digital fiat. We're seeing governments talking about digital fiat, but that will be done in a different context. Stablecoins are really they're attempting to address the issue of friction for high volume traders who need to move in and out of token positions very quickly. And so today, if you have to sell your Bitcoin in order to get to cash because you think the Bitcoin price is going to drop, well, you got to go through the banking system, and that's just time and effort and so on. Whereas if you can move to a stable coin, it's as easy as moving from Bitcoin to Ethereum. You can just move Bitcoin to, and I dare say, Tether, or something more like USDC. I said Tether because Tim has written extensively about Tether. So, and by the way, I highly recommend reading his blog of numbers. Tim has probably one of the best blogs in the space, and I highly recommend reading it. But Tether is in one area that he spent a lot of time doing some really good investigative journalism that I think to this day gets quoted frequently.
All right, audience questions. Raise your hand if you would. Any thoughts? All right, let me bring the mic to you.
You can just speak up if you want.
All right, go ahead.
We'll get
Speak
you.
up. Loud.
Where do you guys see in the next 2 to 3 years government regulation in this space? Like, do you see governments, kind of the Venezuela model, really adopting it, or do you see like a more cautious approach, like in America, or where do you see government?
So I'll take two positions. We say government, I think of the regulatory side of the world, and in the regulatory side of the world, I think that governments are actually, and the regulators are actually meeting. So while we hear about the US is moving at a certain pace and Switzerland at a different pace, all of these governments are actually coordinating. And they're coordinating behind the scenes. And not to say that they're following each other's playbook, but they're exchanging information and understanding. So we see some Singapore and Switzerland are starting to play very similar games that may be different than the US, but again, similar. I think that there is some acceptance as to the role that these things will play, but within the scope of some of the things we have today. So for example, in the securities world, I think it's now clear that, or it's been deemed clearly that by the SEC, that the existing ICO plays we saw were really securities offerings. And we'll go further and say they were unregistered securities offerings. That the fact that exchanges were carrying some of those tokens means that unregistered exchanges were carrying security tokens. So I think we're starting to get a lay of the land. I've always been a proponent of, I don't care what the regulation is, I just want it to be clear so we know what the rules of the game are. If we're gonna say that you can't do these things as utilities, that's fine. Let's talk about what it means to do them as securities, but let's get a clear lay of the land. Right now, it's very difficult for companies in the space who are trying to figure this out to understand where the mines are. Abroad, I think we're starting to see things like Bitcoin and I think the derivatives are all starting to look at whether the forwards are going to be allowed, whether derivatives are going to be allowed, ETFs in particular, I think is the area where there's the most uncertainty. But again, I think there's starting to be some clarity around the roles at each of the agencies. So we have SEC, CFTC, FinCEN, each deciding on what kind of their portion of the watchdog activity is going to be. So I'm enthusiastic. They really don't want to kill innovation. And so what they're trying to do, and if you look at the settlements that have recently taken place, none of those companies were asked to go bankrupt. None of them were asked to close the businesses. They were simply provided the guidelines. They had penalties. They had to return money. But they were given the guidelines they needed to follow in order to be a registered legal and security law. And so I think we're seeing proactive government regulator involvement to get us back to a set of rules that are clear.
Any other thoughts, Jim, before?
Yeah, so to give you a specific example, it's not securities, we talk about AML. The G20 just put out another notice that they're trying to coordinate and collaborate with each other on harmonizing AML-related laws, anti-money laundering laws. And one thing that could make it slightly interesting, I hate overusing that word, but U.S. Treasury has put 2 Bitcoin addresses on their OFAC sanctions list, or the sanctions list. Had to do with 2 Iranian people, or 2 Iranians who contributed to a ransomware attack a year or 2 ago. And so the idea here is that these are blacklisted. Anyone who's moving money in and out between that is also violating sanctions. How do you enforce that, and does that create an alternative blacklisted versus whitelisted Bitcoin economy? I know there's startups or there's companies that provide data analytics to governments to identify these transactions, but over time, how will that affect countries that don't enforce OFAC, or that they don't share that safety? There was a Reuters guy earlier talking about, I'm not sure, I don't want to shill their product, but like at some stage, maybe they don't have the optics into, I'm not sure how if you guys are familiar with how Bitcoin addresses and wallets work. We can go into technical stuff later on, but it could be a little complex once these coins split off into separate wallets over and over again. That'd be a fun panel at some point talking about that.
Follow the coin.
Any other questions from the audience?
So the topic of the conversation was the future of blockchain. So 1 minute for each of you, where you think blockchain might be in 10 years?
Let's start with Jeremy.
10 years, wow. So, I think it's right that blockchain has been one of the more invested legs in venture capital right now, right? Like you look at AI and blockchain, maybe VR, AR, and so I think it's one of those transformative techs. I don't think it changes everything, right? And so I think you will get iconic companies that are built in 10 years that will be household names. But nor do I think that every person on the planet is using a blockchain in every piece of technology. And so I think some companies that are betting on blockchain now, not everybody likes my cloud analogy, but I do think that there are cloud companies that are today, and there are other great companies that are not cloud companies today. And so I think the blockchain in a lot of ways will be like that. And so I hope it opens up and democratizes things. I think that's why a lot of us got involved in the first place. I'm seeing that may or may not happen right now, and I think we're at a pivotal place. But the internet was not necessarily open and honest, right in the early days too. So I think it's sort of incumbent on the companies that get created, the next iconic companies, to stay true to what I think the blockchain, a lot of the people who got involved in the blockchain vision was. I think it's encumbered on a lot of them to help sort of make the ethos of why people got involved actually stayed true. And I think the great internet companies did that, like Mozilla and others. And so I'm hopeful that some of the great blockchain companies will do it too.
I think just real quick, I think blockchain, just to add to you, I think you covered it pretty well. It's just going to become part of everything. I wouldn't say everything, but it's just going to be one of those building blocks, right? It's going to change. I think it's probably going to go away in the way that we know blockchain today, and it's going to evolve to something else. But I really can't tell you what that is. Like, if I could, like, you know, maybe it would be different. But what I do know is that this is not the blockchain that we're going to have in 3 or 5 years, right? So it's going to be continuously changing, and I think it's going to be a very fast evolving technology, much faster than a lot of the technologies that we have today. And it's actually going to be driven by AI, for example, machine learning. A lot of those technologies are going to start coming into blockchain. And I really want to see what that is going to be about. And that's what's exciting to me about the blockchain world, right?
So there's a group I used to hang out with and kind of somewhat skeptics, I would call them pragmatists on the space. And we had 4 rules that we operate under. One was you're an idiot, I'm an idiot, markets are efficient, and you don't want that. And you don't want that, I think, is one that occurs frequently. People are like, oh yeah, it'll be great if we could do that. And then it's like, well, no, you really wouldn't want that. But I think in the markets are efficient, I think blockchains will address problems where they meet the efficiency barrier. So we talked about private securities. So I'll give you an example, real simple example. In venture capital, when you're a fund manager, you have these limited partners who invest in the fund. When a limited partner wants to get out of the fund, it's a very difficult process. It's an expensive process, it's difficult, and it requires attorneys and contracts and so on. Today, the way that works is the limited partner asks the venture fund manager that they want to get out. They then have to find a counterparty to take their position. Those two will then negotiate their positions. The seller will take what's called an illiquidity discount because they can't sell that position easily. And then the contracts are drawn up and the parties will make the exchange. Well, with securitized tokens, one of the things that is certainly being explored aggressively by some companies is the notion that the token contains the rights of that ownership. And now it makes it easier, so long as the counterparty is approved by the fund manager, for those two to just have a simple token exchange transaction, funds move, and we're done. The cost item there is really a tremendous cost savings if they can pull that off. And so what will it look like? Well, I think we'll start to see anywhere where friction can be removed by the use of the technology, we will likely see that technology find a place. Anywhere where it can't, it won't. So for me to sit here and pretend I know the future, very hard. Will it be an identity? It might be, if it removes friction that exists today. But my sense is that follow the friction and see if this is an applicable way of dealing with it, and if it is, probably we'll see some changes.
Yeah, so 3 quick things. Number one, I hope that, like, when people talk when they went to internet events, like in the early 90s, I hope that's the way we reflect on the word blockchain. Like, hope it's never used again. Number 2, back to Kira's point, like, when you go buy things at stores, you don't identify McDonald's as a MasterCard store. You just buy something from them. The exception to that maybe is Costco, who requires Visa today versus Amex. That's about the only exception I think. The third thing is maybe reflecting on 10 years from now, the blight that proof of work coins had on the environment. Like, you're consuming, if you add up, you're consuming basically the resources of the Netherlands when you add them all up. Obviously, it depends on.
I hate you, Tim, because you snuck that in. You knew I was going to go after you on that. You snuck it in.
So, appreciate you guys' time. Thank you.
Oh, too bad. All right, let's get a round of applause for them. Let's get a round of applause for Kevin.
Yeah.
Great.